All righty, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar on tackling food waste and methane emissions from landfills. I'm Jasmine Shu, a senior associate at RMI, supporting the America's All In Coalition. Next slide, please. In case you're unfamiliar, America's All In is the most expansive coalition of leaders ever assembled in support of climate action in the US. We have thousands of members from US cities, states, tribal groups, businesses, universities, faith groups, hospitals, cultural institutions. It's quite a long list. And the All In Coalition is working to advance subnational climate action and accelerate the US economy towards 100% clean energy. We're extremely grateful for all of our members and our partners for your commitment to doing this work together. And also wanted to say a special thank you to our America's All In co-chair, the World Wildlife Fund, and our funders, Michael Bloomberg and Jerry Brown. Now, just wanted to say up top, the goals for this webinar are to, number one, get an understanding of the climate impacts from food waste and landfilling. Two, present how we can take a whole of society or all-in approach with our vast and diverse coalition, as shown here on your screen, to deploy key strategies to reduce waste sector methane emissions. And finally, we want to point to some specific funding and advocacy opportunities to support efforts to curb waste methane. Next slide, please. We have an awesome lineup of speakers for you today. First, we'll have Tom Frankowitz from RMI, who will provide an overview on waste methane. Next, we'll have Alicia Zhao from the University of Maryland Center for Global Sustainability, who will discuss the benefits of an all-in approach to reducing emissions. Next, we'll have Shannon Kennedy, also from UMD, who will highlight efforts from the state of Maryland. And then we get to hear about two success stories from our coalition. First, Gina McCarthy from Austin Resource Recovery of the City of Austin, and Mandy McKay from Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. Then we will reconvene for some actionable next steps and a Q&A session with all of our speakers. And just a reminder that at any point, if you have a question, you can feel free to type that into your Q&A box. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during this portion. And I'd also like to take a moment to say that a recording of today's discussion and any referenced resources and slides will be shared with all attendees after the event. So no worries about frantic note-taking. You can sit back and relax and enjoy the awesome presentations that our speakers have prepared. Next slide, please. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce a special guest to share opening remarks to kick us off. As the first White House National Climate Advisor and former US EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy is one of the country's most respected voices on climate change, the environment, and public health. Her leadership has led to the most ambitious action on climate in US history, with new jobs created and unprecedented clean energy innovation and investments across the country. Gina's commitment to bold action across the Biden administration, along with the help of historic legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, has restored US climate leadership on a global stage and put our climate targets back within reach. Gina McCarthy, if you haven't heard, is also now the new managing co-chair of the America's All In Coalition. So welcome, Gina. I'll pass the mic off to you.
Well, first of all, Jasmine, thank you so much for the great introduction. And welcome, everybody. I am so excited to be with America's All In today as your very new co-chair, so we can get some information and get excited about the major opportunities that we have today to significantly reduce methane emissions from our waste sector. Look, simply put, we're going to talk trash today, right? Because trash is a big contributor to climate change. When food waste and yard waste and other organics are buried in our landfills, they generate and release methane. And methane is 80 times more potent at warming our planet than carbon dioxide. Did you know that Americans throw away 1/3 of their food every year? And did you know that methane emissions are responsible for about 1/3 of the warming impacts that we're experiencing across our country right now? That's from wildfires to record heats to flash flooding and more. And our landfills are the third largest source of methane in the United States. So that's why we have to talk trash today, because all of the annual emissions that are spewing from landfills are equivalent to driving 66 million gas-powered cars and operating 79 coal-fired power plants. In fact, there is so much methane leaking from our landfills that aircraft and satellite technology can actually see the pollution all the way from space. So we have to act, and we have to act now. And beyond the planet warming methane, let's not forget that landfills emit hazardous air pollutants. They emit odors and other dangerous gases that impact both the health and well-being of nearby communities. And these are mostly communities disproportionately low income in communities of color that are most impacted, the communities that have been overburdened and under-resourced for decades and decades. So we have to get engaged. So what do we do about this urgent climate and environmental justice issue? Well, first, we need to deal with the upstream efforts to keep organics out of landfills. We have to double down on those efforts. And we need downstream efforts as well, so that we can reduce methane leakage from all of the waste already buried in these landfills. But you know, the really good news is that states and cities and local groups and hundreds of leaders, just like all of you on this webinar, are ready to step up to provide the focused energy and the enthusiasm that we need to stop food waste, to expand food donations, and to make recycling of organics happen at the scale that it must happen. You know, already there are several states with organic diversion requirements. That's a terrific start. There's hundreds of municipalities that are already offering curbside composting collection. That's another great opportunity. And there's more than 45 companies that have made public commitments to have the food loss and waste in their own operations. That's terrific news. And we even have 3 states, California, Oregon, and Maryland, that have set stronger standards than even EPA has to control methane leakage from landfills. Hey, EPA, you better get moving, or I'm going to go find you. Look, this progress really is exciting, but we all know that it's just not enough to meet our national targets to reduce food waste, methane, and greenhouse gases more broadly. That's why we're having today's webinar. We have to talk about how we can work together, how we can close the gap together to scale up our work at the subnational level, to capitalize on federal funding opportunities in the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. Let's not let those opportunities pass us by. Let's grab them. And let's push for additional federal action through the Farm Bill and my beloved EPA that needs to get on the ball to reduce landfill methane by setting more stringent standards. We have to all work together. We all know that cutting methane is one of the strongest levers that we have to slow the rate of near-term warming, which is why action on food waste and landfills has to be a critical part of all of our climate strategies. And let's not forget that the benefits of this work go well beyond reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They help us tackle food insecurity, lower health risks, create lots and lots of good-paying jobs in the circular economy, and bring new products to market, like compost, that should by now be available everywhere. This work isn't just about stabilizing the planet. It's really about making people's lives better right now. You know, I am more optimistic than ever that we are ready to take this whole of society approach that combines federal actions with steps from states and cities and businesses. I am so excited because of you, because with your help, we can make huge progress in reducing methane emissions and giving ourselves a real shot at meeting and even exceeding our climate goals. So thank you for joining the call today. Thank you to America is All In for hosting this important event. I just can't wait to see all the great work that this coalition will deliver. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Gina. Really appreciate you being with us today. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the key drivers of waste methane and readily available solutions to cut emissions today. Next. Next slide, please. So let's start with the problem. When organic waste, including food waste, yard waste, cardboard, and any other biodegradable waste, decomposes in the landfill without oxygen, it generates methane, a super potent greenhouse gas. We send over 150 million tons of waste to municipal landfills in the US each year, with food waste being the single most landfilled material. Modern landfills are designed to capture and control the methane generated from organic waste through a system of wells, covers, and flares, as you can see on the slide. But unfortunately, landfills leak. Significant amounts of methane escape into the atmosphere through the landfill cover, the working face, malfunctioning flares, or damaged wells, for example. Altogether, landfills are the third largest source of methane in the United States. Next. So what can we do about this? Strategies to cut landfill methane emissions generally fall into two broad categories, as you can see here: upstream prevention and downstream mitigation, both equally important. Upstream strategies avoid locking in future methane emissions and have the biggest climate benefits over time. But downstream strategies are also critically important to cut methane emissions quickly from all the organic waste already sitting in our landfills today. And remember, cutting methane is the strongest lever that we have to slow the rate of warming in the near term. Next. Upstream strategies focusing on reducing organic waste disposal to prevent methane generation are shown here in this hierarchy. This approach prioritizes surplus reduction and waste prevention through smart agricultural practices, improved supply and demand management, and behavioral change. Followed by rescue strategies, which include donating edible surplus to food banks, soup kitchens, and shelters. With residual organics having the option to be recycled into animal feed, compost, or biogas for energy and nutrient recovery. Following the food waste hierarchy maximizes emission reductions and brings several co-benefits, helping to address food insecurity, reduce dependence on land-intensive feed crops and carbon-intensive fuels, improving soil health, sequestering carbon, and creating jobs. Next. Downstream. Downstream strategies focus on capturing methane and stopping leaks at the landfill. Smart landfill design, operations, and monitoring can significantly reduce emissions at the landfill. These strategies leverage advanced monitoring technologies, many of which come from the oil and gas sector, to quickly find and fix leaks while optimizing gas collection system and landfill covers to improve gas recovery and to keep the methane and other harmful pollutants out of our neighborhoods and atmosphere. In sum, we need both upstream and downstream approaches together. And I'm excited to talk about these through specific programs and policies that can get us there on the webinar today.
Thanks, Tom, for those insights. Now I'll hand it over to Alicia Zhao and Shannon Kennedy from the University of Maryland to discuss the emissions reduction potential of an all-in approach to waste methane and highlight recent upstream and downstream progress in Maryland.
Thank you, Jasmine. Hello, my name is Alicia Zhao. I'm a research manager at the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. And here at CGS, we lead the quantitative analysis for the All-In Coalition. So I'm just going to zoom out a bit here and talk about the critical role methane plays in global and national climate mitigation. And then I'll also talk a bit about how waste methane fits into all of that. Next. So a lot of attention has been focused on mitigating carbon dioxide emissions through energy sector decarbonization. But methane's also a key greenhouse gas that has emerged as a new area for climate mitigation through a series of major commitments from the world's leaders. So first, through the Global Methane Pledge in 2021, the US and over 100 other countries committed to reducing methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And through that, the US and China have also agreed upon additional joint actions on methane. And then at the North American Leader Summit earlier this year, the US, Canada, and Mexico also pledged to reduce methane emissions, specifically from the waste sector, by at least 15% by 2030. And then zooming into the national level, the US also has our own climate target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. The All-In Methane report, which we released last year, shows that reducing methane emissions can get us at least 8% of that 50 to 52. Next. So diving deeper into the report, we find that if both subnational and federal actors work together, overall methane emissions in the US can be reduced by 227 megatons of CO2 equivalent. And that's more than 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. And we also find that methane emissions in the waste sector specifically can be decreased by 15%. So both of these numbers help us meet the Global Methane Pledge as well as the North American Leader Summit target. So how do we get to these numbers? I'll just walk you through this chart over here, which was pulled from the report. So here we have methane emissions broken down by sector. And starting from the left, we have historical methane emissions in the US through 2020. You can see here that energy and agriculture are the largest emitters of methane, followed by waste in the green. And following that, we have a 2030 baseline from the EPA, which is basically what the emissions level would be in 2030 if we didn't take any additional actions to reduce methane emissions. From the baseline, we have additional methane emissions reductions that would get us to the 2030 target of 30%. For each sector, starting with the energy sector, the dark blue box shows emissions reductions we could get from stepped up actions from just subnational actors, and the light blue shows the additional reductions we could get if the federal government would also step up. As you can see, the waste sector is a relatively small but still key contributor to help us get over the 30% mark. Key policies that we implemented in the waste sector include a methane fee and waste reduction goals at the federal level. And that's paired with state and local level waste diversion policies, landfill regulations, as well as emissions monitoring and accounting tools similar to those already implemented in states like California, Massachusetts, and Washington. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Shannon to talk about the different roles that federal and subnational actors play in reducing waste methane emissions.
Thank you, Alicia. Yes, my name is Shannon Kennedy, and I also am at the Center for Global Sustainability. I work closely with Alicia on our US subnational portfolio. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this all-of-society approach looks like in the waste sector. And there is a lot that can be done, not only from these current policies, which Alicia was discussing, but these can extend even further. So the federal government can set additional landfill regulations. They can help set food waste reduction goals. They can incentivize waste and recycling infrastructure. And they can importantly expand the methane fee to cover the waste sector, which right now it only covers the oil and gas sector in the IRA. States can also largely help extend and expand these federal regulations through setting their own landfill standards and also setting new waste diversion ordinances. And states, along with local governments and businesses, can help implement these critical policies and make sure that the ordinances that are in place have their full effect. For example, state-level methane monitoring composting programs can work to directly with local governments, communities, universities, businesses, et cetera, to help make sure that the education is there to realize these in an accessible and equitable way, and not only realizes the methane reductions, but the benefits to people's health, to our communities, to just cleaning up our communities more broadly. Next slide. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this means in context. So the state of Maryland last year set the most aggressive climate target in the US at the state level. They are aiming to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 60% from 2006 levels by 2031. And so at the Center for Global Sustainability, we took that broad US-wide modeling that Alicia was talking about, and we applied it at the state level in Maryland for the first time. And yes, the waste sector does play a role. So in Maryland, the waste sector can deliver 39% GHG emissions reductions by 2031, which is roughly equivalent to 4% of the reductions needed to meet that 60% goal. Importantly, Maryland just passed a new municipal solid waste landfill regulation to help reduce these methane emissions as well. In addition, Maryland also has established a voluntary waste diversion goal of 60% and a voluntary recycling rate of 55%. And there's a lot more that can be done to help realize these reductions. Key policies and actions that are critical to implement these new standards from an all of society perspective include implementing a zero waste hierarchy, which provides guidance for implementing waste management policies, emphasizing the need to reduce and rethink the amount of waste produced in the first place. They also can help from all levels at the state to improve data on waste sources. This is a critical way that we can help monitor what these methane emissions even are and where they are and how intense they are across the state. And there's a lot that can be done to identify those so we can make sure the policies are in place in the correct way. Additionally, you've already heard a lot about composting and the upstream, downstream strategies, but I think something that's really important and comes out of our analysis is this concept of all society, everyone working together. And one of the best ways that this can be done is by universal and accessible composting. So while Maryland has several policies to reduce the amount of waste sent to landfills, it does not have a universal composting program. Several counties do have composting programs that they are expanding, but there is still challenges to ensure that rural communities and multifamily buildings, such as in apartment complexes, also reap these benefits of a composting program, and also can get the education on what this even means. So local governments and universities can help with that as well, which brings me to my next slide. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the University of Maryland and what we're doing here on my own campus to help in these efforts. So universities offer a really great opportunity for how individual institutions within states can help connect the dots between communities, the state government, even the federal government at times to help expand on these policies and implement them. We not only are helping educate the next generation of climate leaders, we are actually reducing emissions on our own campus. And a lot of that is through composting bins. You can see this picture from Alicia's desk of a mini compost bin and the compost bins we see every day. We are committed to diverting we diverted 44% of waste in 2022, and there's a lot more happening to do that. And I'm sure that's happening in your own communities as well. So I encourage you all to get involved in that. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon and Alicia. Awesome to hear about your research and what's happening in your neck of the woods. Now we will welcome Gina McCarthy to present a case study from Austin, Texas.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I am Gina McCarthy, the Assistant Director of Austin Resource Recovery, the solid waste utility in Austin, Texas. And on the next slide, you'll see a picture of Austin. And we are a fast-growing city, recently named the 10th largest in the nation, with rapid population growth both in and around our city limits. On the next slide, you'll see that 3 of our neighboring cities were among the top fastest growing cities, large cities in the country. Just to give a little context, we're the capital city of Texas, home to a number of colleges and universities, a growing tech industry, and I always like to share the live music capital of the world. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit about Austin Resource Recovery. Like I said, we're the solid waste utility for the city of Austin. In 2011, we established a zero waste goal to divert 90% of material from landfills by the year 2040. And we have a vision to drive global transformation of traditional waste management to sustainable resource recovery. Next slide. You will see a composition study of Austin's waste that shows roughly 37% of material is compostable, about 18% is reusable or recoverable, and about 28% is recyclable. And so we are a large city with a big goal, but we don't have direct control over all the material that is generated in our city as the solid waste utility. On the next slide, you'll see a breakdown of that, where that shows that we only directly control about 15% of waste generation in Austin, and that represents our direct customers who we provide a cart-based service, including weekly trash and compost collection, as well as bi-weekly recycling. So that remaining 85% is collected and processed by private haulers. So to reach that big zero waste goal as a community, we have to develop policies and programs that really help influence that 85%, which is largely commercial, multifamily, construction, demolition, and some other types of waste streams. But given today's topic, I'm really going to highlight some of the services, policies, and programs we have here in Austin that focus on the organic stream. On the next slide, you'll see Austin Resource Recovery provides weekly cart-based compost collection for all of our curbside customers. And we're just at, I think, a little over 220,000 customers. And this includes yard trimmings, food scraps, and food soiled paper. We also provide a regular large brush collection on a twice per year basis and are piloting an on-call program so that we can collect that material whenever our customers need it. For the commercial and multifamily properties, that 85%, one of the key policies we have to influence organics in that stream is the Universal Recycling Ordinance. And it requires that each property provides a minimum level of recycling, and any commercial property with a food permit is required to divert organic material. And the policy really does emphasize the food waste hierarchy that you saw before, encouraging reduction and food recovery or donation first before moving into composting as a diversion mechanism. And then next month, new for the city of Austin, next month our city council will consider an amendment to that ordinance, which would expand it to require composting at multifamily properties as well. On this slide, you'll see that in addition to our direct service and policy, we also provide incentives and other resources for the community. We have a zero waste business rebate that is intended to encourage and support those that are willing to take the next step towards reducing waste in their operations. Recently, we have focused this rebate on supporting food rescue infrastructure. On the next slide, you'll see how that can be used. Businesses can receive up to $1,800 for expenses related to improving food storage or equipment related to the transport of recovered food. So not only does this rebate help provide support for keeping materials out of the landfill, but it also helps us as a city because we get better data and information about the types of policies and programs that will work in our community. And I've picked out on the next slide a few examples of how the rebate has been used for organics in the local Austin community. We've had restaurants switch from disposable to reusable dishes. We've had a grocery store purchase indoor composting bins and compostable to-go items, and similar other examples in small businesses around town. I think there's a few more on the next slide. So you see an ice cream shop. They're small restaurants that we have a sorority house at a university. And then on the next slide, I'd like to highlight a pitch event that we have developed in our circular economy program. Reverse pitch is a competition that turns valuable raw materials that are leaving local businesses as waste into raw materials for new or expanding social enterprises. This program has been around since 2015, so we're approaching 10 years of this program, and offers a $10,000 prize as well as lots of small business support to these entrepreneurs. And we've had several businesses over the years that have focused on organic materials. For example, spent grain from a distillery was used to create beverage coasters. Another use for spent grain that was pitched was mixing with wooden pallets to develop biochar filter socks, which help with soil erosion and keep toxins out of stormwater runoff. And one of the first businesses that won the competition developed a food scrap composting service utilizing fly larvae in a bucket. And on the next slide, I will close. We have a lot going on Austin, and I'm trying to be mindful of time, but a couple of other planning efforts that I just wanted to touch on and encourage you to look at further that are also focused on methane reduction. And one of those is the Climate Equity Plan, which includes 2 relevant focus areas, food and product consumption, as well as natural systems. So you'll see a lot in that plan about reduction of emissions, increasing plant-based diets, looking at transportation emissions as well. It has an ambitious goal to equitably reach net zero community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2040. So 2040 is a hot number here in Austin. We also have a report on the state of Austin's food system and are actually just beginning a process to create our first large-scale food planning effort to ensure that our local food system is connected, protected, and community integrated in a way that benefits everyone. So I tried to pick and choose a handful of things from Austin to share with you guys today. But again, I thank you for being part of the conversation and the effort to really make a difference in our country.
Thanks, Gina, for sharing all the good things happening in Austin. Next, we'll welcome Mandy to talk about her work at Sierra Nevada Brewing Company.
Awesome. Thanks, Jasmine. Hi, everyone. Mandy McKay with Sierra Nevada. I'm the Director of Environmental and Social Impact here. Thanks for inviting me to this. This is one of my favorite topics, food waste, landfill diversion, zero waste in general. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about some of the work we're doing. So on the next slide, I'll just start everyone off with a really high-level overview of who we are. If you're not familiar with us, so we've been around since 1980. We were founded in Chico, California, which is Northern California, or about an hour and a half north of Sacramento. And then about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, we opened up a second facility in Western North Carolina, about 20 minutes outside of Asheville. So we now have 2 brewing facilities. And then just kind of note, we're still privately owned and operated by our founder, Ken Grossman, and his 2 children, which you can see there in the upper right. So that makes a difference because we're still privately held. It's rare these days, especially in the craft beer industry. We're now the 3rd largest craft brewery in the country. Got about 1,100 employees company-wide. We're in all 50 states. So we're small in terms of beer overall, but fairly large in craft beer. So that's kind of who we are, and I'll dive into kind of what we've been doing. We've been working on zero waste for a long time. So on the next slide, our commitment really goes back decades. So we set a zero waste goal and commitment 25 years ago. And so we've been working hard on it and have really dialed it in. And it's been something that's carried through the years and core to who we are. So we're currently diverting, and we've maintained a diversion rate of over 99% of our solid waste from landfill. Really proud of that. We work really hard on it. And again, we've carried that through for years now. We were actually the first true platinum certified zero waste business, and actually helped found that certification program. I've got the hierarchy here, echoing back to Tom's slides, and others have mentioned it. We really do use that, and we follow that throughout our zero waste program. So we've built it around that funnel, and we think about it every time we make any kind of decision around waste or purchasing. So we've got a pretty robust zero waste program for any material you can possibly think of that we're generating. You can see a few of them there. And of course, since we're talking about organic waste here, I'm going to dive into those byproducts. So on the next slide, I'll talk about spent grain and spent yeast. Those are obviously the largest volume of waste that we're generating as a brewery. It's the largest byproduct of any brewery, most likely. So company-wide, spent grain, we're generating about 250,000 pounds a day of spent grain between both of our breweries. All of that is currently going for cattle feed for dairy cows. This actually is it's a revenue stream for us. So once you hit a certain size, it's a pretty common outlet for breweries to use it as animal feed, which makes a lot of sense. Again, it's a revenue source for us, and it's a pretty good quality protein and also fiber, and it's mixed in with their other feed. On the spent yeast side, we're doing a couple different things with spent yeast. So at our California facility, we're generating about 40,000 pounds a day of spent yeast. It's actually mixed in with that spent grain, and the spent yeast is like a milkshake consistency. So it's kind of mixed in with that spent grain. That's also going for cattle feed. But at our facility in North Carolina, we actually designed in a way to recover some energy out of that spent yeast and close a loop. So we kind of thought about what we had learned over the years at our headquarter brewery and designed in an on-site wastewater treatment plant that could handle the spent yeast. So what we're doing there is we're generating about 30,000 pounds a day of spent yeast from that facility. We run it through our on-site wastewater treatment plant, which is really intended to treat our wastewater. So all the water that we use to make beer, all the water that we use to clean things, pretty much all processed water. So no sewer water or sanitary water, but all the brewing effluent. We also send the spent yeast through that treatment plant, which uses anaerobic digestion. Those on the call are probably familiar that when you digest, that's a common way to break down organic material, and then you can recover the methane. So it's actually mostly methane that we're generating in that wastewater treatment facility. We capture that methane and then we use it to fuel our boilers and microturbines that make electricity for the facility. So it's a really nice closed loop. We don't do that in our California brewery because our wastewater treatment plant on site is not equipped for the solids that the yeast sends, but we were able to do that at our North Carolina brewery. So we are benefiting from that waste stream and using it to make energy. Next slide. On the food waste side, we've been, again, thinking about food waste for a long time. At both of our breweries, we have very popular and high volume restaurants and tap rooms. So we've been thinking about food waste and diverting food waste since 2010. And back then, we're not Austin, so we don't have these wonderful programs for curbside or commercial food routes. So back then, there was nowhere to send our food waste for composting regionally. Again, we're in Northern California. It's a fairly rural area. So the closest place that we could divert our food waste from our restaurant was over 100 miles away, which kind of negates the point of composting and all the methane benefits that you achieve from that if you have to drive it for 100 miles. So we worked with the city and the county to try to open a regional composting facility. There just wasn't a lot of appetite at the time. There wasn't funding. There weren't regulations back then to do that. So we had that zero waste goal, and we decided we're going to do it ourselves. So we invested in our own in-vessel composting machine, which you can see in the upper right. It's called the Hot Rot. It's still the only hot rot system in the United States. We've been operating it since 2010, and it's been composting all of our food waste from the restaurant, also our break rooms, employee events, and other organics here and there, some landscaping debris, and a very small amount of like hops and spent grain as well. So over the lifetime of that in-vessel machine, we've avoided almost 2,000 metric tons of CO2 just from our food waste from our one restaurant, which is really great. And what's even better is we can utilize all that compost that we've been making from the hot rot on site. So we're using it in any of our agricultural programs. We grow produce and herbs for our restaurant. We also grow some hops. We grow some barley. So we're able to use that compost that we're generating in any of those applications. In North Carolina, we are also diverting food waste from our tap room, but we're fortunate to have a regional composting facility out there. So we're able to support that facility and utilize that as well as everyone else in the community, which makes the most sense. Going back to Shannon's comment around, you've got to have those facilities regionally or locally. So you can spend all day, collecting your organics separately, but if you don't have anywhere to send it, that's a problem. So that's where policies and regulations and support for those facilities at the state level really make a lot of sense. Next slide. I'll finish up on the edible food side. So what's really great, I'll spend just a second talking about SB 1383. So California is one of those states that does have an organics diversion regulation now in place. It was passed in 2016. It's been implemented starting 2022. And it was specifically designed for all of the things that Gina McCarthy talked about at the opening. So specifically designed to reduce methane emissions from landfills. It covers residents and businesses and government agencies to comply. And it also tackles food waste and making sure that we can get edible food to the people that need it. So that upstream target as well. And so out of that regulation, we were donating food previously, and we had different outlets and partners that we would work on or work with for any food waste coming out of our tap rooms that are still edible. But it was challenging, and I'll admit it was hard to, get the food there or have the partner come pick it up from us or store it. And so what's really great that's come out of SB 1383 is this organization 530 Food Rescue, and they've built a model that I would highly encourage people to look into. So I put the link there in their email. It's wonderful. So they're an organization that connects volunteer drivers to organizations like ours that have food to donate, and will get it to the places that it needs to go: shelters, youth organizations, food banks, and other places. It's fantastic, and it has made the donation process of edible food so much easier and so much more streamlined for businesses. And so that came out of this regulation, this SB 1383. They were bolstered by that, and they were able to kind of set themselves up because of that policy. So that's who we're using currently in California. It's great. So we're donating any and all food that we can from our venue, our event venue, our restaurant, and also our garden that I mentioned, where we're growing food for the restaurant. So we often have surplus veggies and things that we can donate. So that wraps up our initiatives, and I'm happy to answer any questions on any of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandy, for talking through your awesome progress at Sierra Nevada. So now with all this information, I want to turn it back to Tom and discuss how we can build upon all of these great success stories and what's next.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. Well, the good thing is, it's great to follow up after some of these great examples, I think it just shows what's possible. And there's a number of different policies and incentives and other opportunities that states and organizations and faith-based groups can take advantage of. Next slide, please. So let's start with recommendations for non-governmental organizations. When it comes to reducing food waste, there's a lot that organizations can do to take action. The great news is that, like some of the examples we've seen today, we don't have to start from scratch. Whether you're a business, school, faith-based group, healthcare provider, there's a lot of tailored resources out there to help you divert and reduce waste in your organization. We'll share a lot of those after the call, but I'll highlight a few examples. Here's 3 high-level recommendations that anyone can follow. The first is to incorporate food waste prevention and diversion targets into broader climate plans. Waste is actually often overlooked when it comes to climate plans, so setting measurable targets around reduction and diversion is a really important first step. Conducting a waste audit. Actually, oftentimes conducting a waste audit is the first step to even know what your problem is. It's really important to kind of understand what your baseline is to create actionable targets. Follow the food waste hierarchy. I appreciate that many of the presentations included it, because it really is. It's fundamental, but it's really important to help you strategize. Partnering with local food banks and shelters to donate your surplus. Working with organic haulers, farms, composting facilities, and even if you don't have local infrastructure, consider composting on site, as Sierra Nevada does. And also keep in mind that there's federal liability protections, tax deductions available for food donation, and then there may be other local incentives available to your organization depending where you're located. Implementing these strategies can save your organization money while also reducing emissions, feeding families in need, and creating value-added value-added products like compost. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of things on the slide. I definitely won't go into all of them, but I'll highlight a few model programs and policies that states and cities have adopted to reduce emissions upstream and downstream, with the hope that others will be able to follow suit. So starting with upstream, several states and cities have passed legislation or ordinances to limit organic waste that's disposed in landfills, while also encouraging alternatives like source reduction, donating food, composting, and digestion. California's SB 1383 has already been mentioned multiple times, but you've also heard another great example at the city level from Austin. Successful organics diversion policies generally take a phased-in approach, investing in community outreach, providing grants for implementation, and infrastructure build-out. Composting or biogas procurement plans can also help ensure that organics recycling facilities have a lasting revenue source. Even without legislation, states and cities can advance voluntary efforts to reduce and recover food waste by offering organics collection and drop-off for residents, encouraging or incentivizing businesses to reduce food waste, and launching outreach campaigns. And oftentimes the outreach campaigns have to be ongoing because you'll move the needle and people forget, so it's important for it to be an ongoing effort. Our friends at the Zero Food Waste Coalition published a great toolkit on upstream strategies for states, and EPA has helpful resources for municipalities as well. Downstream, there's many ways for states and cities to reduce emissions from the landfill itself. 3 states, California, Oregon, and Maryland, have taken action to better control their landfill methane emissions by setting stronger air regulations than EPA. And state rules have made several improvements to landfill design, operational, and monitoring requirements to increase methane capture and reduce the risk of large leaks. States and cities can also leverage new data from satellites and aircraft surveys to identify methane superemitters. Gina mentioned at the very beginning that, in some places the leaks are so big you could see them from space. And this is one of the benefits of new and emerging technology. We've actually seen successful examples of coordination between Carbon Mapper and state agencies, with landfill operators in Pennsylvania and California both. And finally, on the voluntary side, many landfills are municipally owned and operated, and we urge them to implement best management practices at their landfills. They could do things to improve cover, gas collection, and monitoring to reduce harmful emissions today. Next. So there's multiple funding opportunities to support methane reductions. Federal funding, including the recent support from the Inflation Reduction Act or the IRA, the bipartisan infrastructure law, can help states and localities implement these programs and policies. There are a few funding opportunities here as well, but I'll emphasize one of them in particular. The Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program from the IRA supports state, local governments, and tribes with over $5 billion available for implementation of climate action plans, or rather to implement activities. But they actually have to start by submitting a priority climate action plan by 2024. So we'd encourage folks to take advantage of this great opportunity. There's also a great way to fund waste methane efforts through this CPRG, and we really encourage folks to try to submit their climate action plan in time. And it also supports landfill mitigation programs, organics diversion, and a lot of the things talked about on today's webinar. Next. So as we stressed on the webinar today, there's a lot of things that subnational leaders are already doing to pave the way on methane mitigation. And we encourage folks to take on some of these efforts locally. But the fact of the matter is that federal action is needed to support and scale up these efforts. And we want to highlight 2 really important opportunities for folks on the call today. The Farm Bill authorization is scheduled for this year, with opportunities to increase funding for planning and infrastructure to reduce food waste and enhance recovery and recycling. The Zero Food Waste Coalition has published a great Farm Bill report and an open letter that we'd encourage folks to check out. Another really critical opportunity, as mentioned today earlier in the call by Gina, is EPA landfill methane regulations. The US EPA sets standards under the Clean Air Act to control methane and other pollutants from landfills. And the agency is actually required to review these rules in 2024. So we see this as a major opportunity for emission reductions by updating standards to align with the latest best practices and technologies in methane monitoring, gas collection, and cover, while also encouraging organics diversion. EPA can build from some of these state efforts and prior work in the oil and gas sector to slash methane emissions, protect landfill adjacent communities, and advance its broader climate and environmental justice goals. Several organizations have petitioned the EPA to start updating these standards today, and we'd welcome your support. Next. So stay tuned for a list of resources on model programs, policies, and funding opportunities that we'll distribute after the webinar, so everyone's equipped to take action. And we invite you to join our letter urging EPA to update its landfill methane regulations and keep food waste out of landfills. We would love to elevate subnational voices on this issue and appreciate everyone's participation today to be part of that effort. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. So it sounds like there is a lot to do. Now I want to invite back all of our speakers for our Q&A, and we have about 8 minutes for that. So remember to enter any questions through the Q&A function if you have any. But I wanted to start us off, and I wanted to direct this to Shannon from UMD and Gina from the city of Austin. So one of the questions we received is, I'm based in Oklahoma, where emissions reductions and environmental benefits alone aren't necessarily compelling enough for adopting new local or state policies. I was wondering which, if any, of these methane reduction strategies offer any cost reduction, any risk mitigation, or any other kinds of additional benefits that could be centered in advocacy efforts. Can you talk about the co-benefits of methane mitigation?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, so we find in our analysis that not only can these policies help reduce emissions that are harmful in their own right, but there are many co-benefits that can be realized, and sometimes not even the main intention of a policy. And for example, when it comes to methane reductions and food waste, a lot of these benefits are health impacts, access to food and nutrition for all. And just for example, in Maryland's Climate Pathway, which I discussed, we modeled Maryland's organics recycling and waste diversion program, which is a mouthful, but this policy primarily is aiming to prevent waste before it occurs. But we found that this can also help recover edible food that otherwise would have been put in the landfill. These type of policies aren't perfect. There's a lot more that needs to be done. But you know, I think this idea of communities working directly with governments, farmers, and distributors can help design community-driven policies like you heard a lot about in Austin and others. And they can build on the top-down incentives that are already in place. And especially as we think about the growth and transition to a clean economy, policies need to account for this equity and access to food and benefits beyond just emissions reductions.
And I would add to that, I echo the benefits. I would add an example from Austin. I mentioned very briefly the reverse pitch program, which is a program that grew out of our circular economy initiative here in Austin. And we really are working towards greater circularity, kind of moving beyond zero waste, and how do we really create circularity in our local ecosystem. And in Austin, the solid waste utility partners with our economic development department to provide some additional benefits that are beyond talking about landfills. We're talking about job creation. And so utilizing some of these creative social entrepreneurship initiatives to create jobs, build skills, looking at workforce development, and it can provide additional economic benefits to our community. And you talked a little bit, Shannon, about some of the social benefits of looking at equity and access to goods and materials. And so I'd say that's another angle, is looking at economic development and job growth in a city.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Gina. Next question is for Mandy at Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. Mandy, really appreciate all the work you're doing in this space. Curious how food waste became a priority for your business, and if there are any financial benefits for the business for this work.
So I briefly talked about it, but our part of that zero waste goal that we set a long time ago a lot of that was around, I mean, it was around cans and bottles and those normal things, but the food waste, because of the methane emissions impact that we knew existed if you send it to a landfill, that's what drove our owner to prioritizing it. He's an environmentalist at heart and understands these things, and understands the impacts, and just really was not happy sending his food waste to a landfill, because knowing those impacts. So really it was the knowledge of that methane reduction, and that's not the highest and best use, and then it's going to lead to emissions. That's what drove him and us to set our zero waste goal, and specifically to invest in the composting machine, was that we just really did not want to continue sending food waste to the landfill. As far as financial benefits, partially. So by composting on site, we aren't paying to have, you know, that waste product hauled off site by a third-party hauler. So there is some savings there, although we do have to run the machine, of course. And then we also do benefit from the compost itself that we're able to utilize on site. So there are some advantages to that, cost-wise and otherwise. Yeah, pros and cons to it for sure, but it made sense for us.
Awesome. Thanks, Mandy. For the next question, I'm going to bring Gina back up from City of Austin. So this is so impressive what Austin is doing around organics. How many years did it take to get this underway in Austin, in your residential demographic? Are Austin's programs unique among large American cities? And lastly, so this is a lot. Let me know if you need a reread. Has the City of Austin had any state level resistance or state preemption to its efforts for any reasons that you've had to or needed to work around?
Okay, that is a lot. So just tell me what I'm missing. But yes, we have had, and I actually, for years, decades, we have had organics collection curbside for our customers. However, it was just yard trimmings. So we have a program in partnership with our water utility where yard trimmings have been taken and mixed with biosolids from that process to create a compost called Dirt, which we've had in place since the early 80s. However, the curbside cart-based composting collection, which expanded that yard trimmings collection to include food scraps and food soiled paper, rolled out over a period of years. We started in 2017 with a pilot project, and we did make some tweaks. First we started with a larger cart. We didn't allow bags of any kind, no compostable bags. So we learned some lessons and made some tweaks, and that the final expansion of that program was in 2021. So from 2017 to 2021, we had a pandemic in there, which kind of delayed that final rollout. Otherwise, it would have been a little quicker, but it did take time. Part of that was getting customers to get used to the idea of composting. It was also for fees and to roll out the cost to implement such a large program for our community. So that is the composting. I think there is benefit in terms of cost. I think there was a cost question. So it's definitely beneficial for the city, for our ratepayers. The cost to dispose of compostable material is less than taking it to a landfill. So there is a cost benefit to the city, which then gets passed on to our ratepayers in the community. So there was that. There was a preemption. So Austin is in the state of Texas. We often call ourselves a tiny blueberry, but we have had different types of policies in place related to waste minimization. One was a bag ordinance as an example, and you can look up history on that, but there was a single-use bag regulation, and we were trying to eliminate basically single-use plastic bags in our city, and it was in place for several years, 4 or 5 years, and then there was state legislation that did not allow us to any longer enforce that requirement. And so we do have some battles in our community in terms of thinking about an all-in approach from the local to the state to the federal level, how we can build up that infrastructure to be supported across all those sectors so that we can, when we move the needle in terms of reduction, how it can stick and we can be all on the same page together. So
awesome.
There may be
Thanks,
other
Gina.
things I did.
That's okay. And unfortunately, we're out of time. So we will, and thank you everybody for your awesome questions. We'll be sure to try to answer those in our follow-up, but really wanted to thank all of our speakers, all of our attendees today. I think it's really inspiring to think about what we can do if we coordinate together and the critical role that you all play in mitigating landfill emissions. So we'll follow up with these resources. And if you have any questions, our emails are up on the slide. But thanks for your time today and hope you have a good rest of the week.